Friends, today I'm going to begin a new preaching series, digging in and exploring and wrestling with the Ten Commandments. Now, as one reads through the book of Exodus, where we read the story of the giving of the Ten Commandments, one finds a very strange and curious sequence of events. Moses has led the people out of the land of Egypt, liberating them from slavery. As the story proceeds, they come to Mount Sinai, which in some places is referred to as Mount Horeb. And Moses is called up the mountain by God, whereupon God gives the law to Moses. They are written onto tablets of stone. Moses then comes down the mountain and in a moment of anger, he smashes the stone tablets when he discovers that the people of Israel are worshipping a golden calf, which raises an interesting question. Why was Moses angry with the Israelites when they had not yet received the Ten Commandments, in which Commandment 2 indicated that they should not worship any graven images? Moses was angry with them, but they were in fact acting out of ignorance or a lack of knowledge. How often do we do that to other people? In anger, we might blame people for certain things. But it might well be that they are uninformed, acting out of blind ignorance, perhaps. As the story unfolds further, God then calls Moses up the mountain a second time and tells him to bring with him a new set of stone tablets on which he is to write the laws of God. But what is intriguing is that in Exodus 34, where God presents the Ten Commandments for a second time, they are almost completely different from the first set in Exodus 20. Only 3 of the 10 are the same. The rest have to do with religious instructions to keep certain festivals, like the Feast of Unleavened Bread and also the Feast of Weeks. And there are commands to bring the best of their first fruits as an offering to God, commands that the firstborn male of every womb belongs to God and needs to be redeemed with a sacrifice. And a commandment, number 10, that they are not to cook a young goat in its mother's milk. What's going on here? One might ask. Did God have a change of mind? Did he rethink things and decide that the first set of commandments that he presented in Exodus 20 were perhaps a little too stringent or difficult for the people to keep, and so decided on a completely different set that had more to do with religious observances than to do with moral issues like lying, stealing, committing adultery and coveting? And if so, why are we told to observe the first set in Exodus 20 and know almost nothing of the second set in Exodus 34? Now, what is particularly interesting is that if there is any doubt, in Exodus 34 verse 28, this strange set of 10 commandments are explicitly referred to as the 10 commandments, or in Hebrew, the 10 words or utterances. Why is it that we only really know about the 10 commandments in Exodus 20 and have never heard, for most of us, the list of 10 commandments in Exodus 34? I think the answer to that question is what modern psychologists might call cognitive dissonance. Human beings have an enormous capacity to ignore and overlook, and sometimes to synthesize information that otherwise doesn't fit with their understanding or that doesn't make sense. If we read as literal videotape history, that section, it doesn't make sense that within a few chapters of God giving the first set, that he gives an almost completely different set of 10 commandments in Exodus 34. And so biblical readers and preachers over the centuries and rabbis have somehow overlooked the dissonance of Exodus 34 to create in our own minds a seamless story where we only acknowledge the version in Exodus 20. But for anyone with eyes to see it, the second set of commandments is there in black and white, graven in stone, one might say, if we are to interpret the story literally. What is perhaps even more intriguing is that there is in fact a third version of the Ten Commandments a little bit later on in the Bible in Deuteronomy 5. The Deuteronomy 5 version is very similar in substance to the version that we would know in Exodus 20. But there are a few differences in the small print or the fine print, as they might say in legal jargon. The differences might seem small to anyone reading them through quickly in one sitting, but they were significant enough to have sparked quite a major debate over the centuries amongst Jewish rabbis, who speculated that originally God had offered the Ten Commandments as found in Exodus 20 to all the nations of the world, but they rejected them. And so God offered a second, slightly edited version in Deuteronomy 5, more specifically tailored to the story of the people of Israel. These rabbis seem to have overlooked the Exodus 34 version like the rest of us, perhaps because of the same cognitive dissonance. How does one account for the fact that within our own Bibles there are 3 different versions of the Ten Commandments? 2 very similar versions in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5, and one almost unrecognizable version in Exodus 34. What is going on here, one might ask? It tells us that the development of the law in Israel was not a simplified process of Moses going up the mountain, God dictating certain words to Moses, and Moses chiseling them out on tablets of stone. That is the sacred myth or the sacred legend of how the law was given. But the fact that there are 3 versions suggests a different, perhaps more ordinary and organic process of development, whereby over time the Israelite people began to formulate different laws to both cement their national and religious identity, but also to promote a common, agreed upon set of rules and laws that would help to bring a common order for harmonious relationships across the 12 tribes. Scholars would say that Exodus 34, the version that most of us would be unaware of, is in fact the earliest version of the Ten Commandments of the 3. And the way they deduce that is by examining the language and vocabulary of the passage and comparing it with other writings of the same kind and the same language that indicate it is more ancient. It's a little bit like comparing the language of Shakespeare with the language, say, of Stephen King or any other modern writer. This suggests a natural process of development and growth, editing and updating. At some point, instead of all the religious cultic laws about observing the religious feasts and not cooking a young goat in its mother's milk, a later editor updated and changed the content of what was known as the Ten Commandments, so that they became more focused on issues of morality, not lying, not stealing, not committing adultery or coveting. And then at an even later date, the compiler of the book of Deuteronomy would have again slightly edited the Exodus 20 version. But this time the editing process was much more minor in comparison and had to do more with the fine print than the actual substance or content of the commandments themselves. Whoever compiled the book of Exodus had in his possession 2 versions of the Ten Commandments, and for whatever reason made a decision to include them both in the story. He obviously did not feel that he had the authority to leave one set out, and so in the flow of the story he wove both sets into the book of Exodus, including the version in Exodus 20 first, because by that time it was probably the more widely known and accepted version with the kind of moral commandments that they had. And then he tells how Moses smashes the first set in anger and then has to return up the mountain a second time to receive them again. And at this point, the writer or editor of Exodus would have inserted the older and lesser known version that we find in Exodus 34. What does this tell us about the Ten Commandments? Firstly, it tells us that the Ten Commandments, as is I've already suggested, were not quite so set in stone as we say in English, but developed, morphed, changed, and were edited with time. Secondly, as I've suggested, what we are reading in the book of Exodus is clearly not literal videotaped history. Rather, it is what some might call epic history, a mixture of history together with myth and legend to create what we might call sacred myth, which doesn't mean it is without value. I do believe that the Ten Commandments, as we find them in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5, and perhaps to a lesser extent those found in Exodus 34, do indeed have value for us if we are willing to wrestle with what they might mean for us in the 21st century. For they invite us to wrestle with important religious questions, but also perhaps more especially questions of morality in our own lives. What does it mean to be moral today? Thirdly, acknowledging that the Ten Commandments were not literally dictated to Moses on Mount Sinai, but grew as an organic and historical process of moral and religious development within the people of Israel, it should perhaps come as less of a surprise to discover that similar parallel processes occurred within other cultures and nations around the world. And so as a moral code, the Ten Commandments are not completely unique in the world. The code of Hammurabi from ancient Babylon, for example, which predates the Old Testament, while being less religious in nature, also contains prohibitions against murder, adultery, theft, and lying. And the Buddhist tradition also, for example, have what they would call the 10 precepts, some of which, from a moral perspective, are very similar to the 10 commandments. Not killing, not stealing, not misusing sex, and not lying. I need to begin to wrap up this sermon, and perhaps the way to do that would be to make two brief observations. Firstly, it's worth noting that both the Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5 versions of the Ten Commandments are prefaced with the statement, "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery." According to the epic history or the sacred mythology of Israel, God or Jehovah, having liberated or freed the people of Israel from slavery in Egypt, now gives them rules or laws to live by. And these rules or laws to live by are not meant to be oppressive, they are not meant to enslave them again, or to limit the freedom of the people of Israel, but rather, as Alan's story suggests, they are given as a gift in order to protect the freedom of a people who had once been slaves. As any parent would know, true freedom doesn't come from having no rules or boundaries. Children thrive when they have good and reasonable boundaries to live by. And then secondly, it would be worth noting that in both the Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5 versions of the Ten Commandments, the versions that we would be familiar with, they can both be divided into two sections. The first 4 deal with Israel's relationship with God, and the next 6 deal with the Israelites' relationships with each other. And so it could be noted that at the heart of the matter, the Ten Commandments are about relationship. The Israelites' relationship with God and their relationships with each other. And this reminds us that the ultimate purpose of any set of laws or any code of morality is the importance of cultivating and protecting good, wholesome, and life-giving relationships. Laws and rules only serve their purpose when they promote healthy, wholesome relationships. For as Jesus said, the essence of the commandments is about love. Love God with all your heart, mind and soul, and love your neighbor as yourself. In the next few weeks, we will explore and wrestle with each of the 10 commandments, but also interpreting them ultimately through the lens of love. If love is the fulfilling of the law, as Paul says in Romans 8, then the 10 commandments are only valuable to us insofar as they help us to love. Amen.